Very nice.
Hopefully we can do these introductions some justice. So,
Yes.
Scott, I'll let you kick off with some of the bad stuff first. I think we need to talk about why we're actually here this morning and why this is so important in today's world. So,
Absolutely. And whilst none of these titles are from New Zealand, I'll give you a bit of a flavour as to what's happening around the world and across the ditch in Australia. So we talk about social licence as being the vehicle for which we protect the sport. We allow, or the community allows us, I suppose, to operate under a social licence. And what we've seen around the world, primarily in Florida, where racing was so prominent for such a long period of time, was the anti-greyhound people, and that varies around the world, whether it's Coalition for the Protection of Greyhounds in Australia, Animals Australia, or it's the anti-dog people in Florida. They have had a concerted effort to shut down greyhound racing, and unfortunately they've been able to succeed in Florida, and they've been able to succeed in ACT in Australia, in Canberra, and even to a point where the Greens in South Australia, it's their fourth or fifth policy around animal welfare is to shut down greyhound racing. They've achieved the fourth one there, which is to ban jump racing and ensure transparency. So jump racing is gone in South Australia, and they'll work on to the next part, which is to ban it in South Australia. So this is not all doom and gloom. This is actually gives you an opportunity. This is the exciting stuff that we can work on today and discuss and openly throw around ideas to get better and to keep those antis at bay and ensure that we set up for a long period of time. The other thing I wanted to say is that please, throughout this, Michelle and I are really happy for you to just put hands up and introduce us put your hand up and just ask any questions at any time. So let's try and make it a bit more interactive. So this slide here gives a bit of a holistic view to racing safety, and we'll cover off, the track component today. We'll cover off healthy greyhounds, and part of this is informing participants in the other space and talk about welfare as well. But the most important thing to understand is that racing injuries, and I call them racing injuries as opposed to track injuries, and that's a really critical discussion piece because what tends to happen is an injury occurs on a track and the track gets the blame for it. What we'll hopefully go through today is that it is a much more holistic system than that. There are a lot more inputs to those injuries. Yes, they occur there. Yes, they are recorded against that track. However, there's a lot of factors that could lead up to that injury and a lot of factors that can affect the type of injury. So we control what we can control around the tracks, and we will talk about how we can make those better and measurements and design and all of those elements. But this system here, and Michelle I'm sure will agree, it's not just tracks, it's not just presenting healthy greyhounds, because if you present healthy greyhounds to a bad track, it's going to be bad. If the participants aren't informed, well, they're not going to present healthy greyhounds, and around it goes. So hopefully this gives you a bit of a holistic view of what we're trying to achieve.
Yeah, I agree. And I think it shows how everyone needs to work together. I mean, racing safety is everybody's responsibility, and if we all work together, each one of us in that little circle, then we can achieve safer racing. When one of the parts actually collapses, then everybody is implicated and everybody is painted with the same brush. So we all need to work together, use all of our combined knowledge to ensure that we have safe racing.
Absolutely. So today we've got three major topics: Greyhound Fitness, racing incidents, and then track design and maintenance. So we're going to break them up into those three topics. Michelle and I will wax lyrically through them. We'll get to the end of those topics and then hopefully open it up to you guys to ask any questions at all, any curly ones, any easy ones. We're happy to either hopefully give you the answer on the spot, if not take them on notice, because ideally these are the sessions that allow you to get that feedback, to ask the question that you might not have asked otherwise, and hopefully go away from here, well armed to go forward.
So I'm going to start off with Greyhound Fitness because I think this is something where our participants really can have the biggest impact, right, in terms of racing safety. So why do we need to focus on serious injuries? Well, it might seem really obvious to everyone, and it should by now. And that's because our greyhound welfare is our number one priority, right? Without greyhounds, we don't have a sport. They are what keeps everybody going and keeps all of us in jobs. So they are our most important participants, but they're also important because they're animals, they're sentient, and their health and their welfare really matters, okay? So you can see this is a really nasty fracture that happened on the track, and these are the things that we're trying to avoid at all costs. The second point is injuries cost a lot of money. They don't only cost a lot of money in terms of the cost to fix the injury or treat the injury. Each dog that you prepare for racing is an investment that you've made. It's an investment in time. It's an investment throughout that dog to prepare it to that point. And taking one greyhound out of the racing system puts a strain on all the other greyhounds that are currently racing. So it takes a percentage of greyhounds out of our racing population every time one is injured. And that's a cost on our industry. The other reason it's so important, the future of our industry is dependent on having the lowest injury rate that we can have, okay? This is the Achilles heel of our industry. And the antis know that, and they know that we're always going to have a degree of injuries. We know that too. Any athlete competing in any sport has an injury rate, okay? What we need to do is keep the serious injuries to a minimum. So those really, really bad ones need to be minimized, and we need to pick them up when the dog's got a little muscle strain and rest them appropriately and get them back racing healthy. And again, our social license, as we talked about earlier, is really dependent on having the lowest serious injury rate we can achieve. And social license is a funny thing because industries that have social license to operate get to basically operate freely, right? Nobody really scrutinizes them or looks at them too closely. But as soon as there's some concerns with an industry, then your social license is under question. And then in order to operate, you need to be really well regulated and scrutinized. And they almost put a lot of hurdles in your path, okay? And they make you jump through all of them, and they watch very closely how you govern that industry. And that's sort of the environment that we're operating in at the moment. But that's necessary. And the reason it's necessary is because it enables us to demonstrate that we're open, we're transparent, and that we know how to handle and minimize these concerns, and therefore we can continue to operate. So having a look at Greyhound Fitness, basically what I wanted to do is we've had a look at a whole lot of data in the last 12 months. We basically handed over all of the GRNZ data to the RIB's analyst, and we said, go for your life. Have a good look at all of it. Let's see what conclusions we can draw from some of this data. So I'd like to credit their analyst for a lot of what I'm going to present you today. And a lot of these things I'd also looked at in New South Wales, and we know hold true through other data sets and other greyhound racing jurisdictions. And I wanted to be able to tell you guys what we know, because we're not the ones preparing the dogs for racing, you are. And we need you to know these things so that you're best able to make decisions for your racing dogs, okay? So some of the things we're seeing in the data as correlations for serious injury, they include age. So we know that older greyhounds, and I'm going to take you through some of the data that we have, are at risk, okay? We know that greyhounds that have had a 21-day break from racing, they're hugely at risk when they come back to race of having an injury. The age that you start greyhounds racing, we know that can be a factor, and that's very much the same in racehorses. The earlier you start them, and the way that you start them into racing is very, very important. Hanging on to a greyhound until it's 3 to 4 years of age before you start it is not the best way to go. Weight changes, so paying attention to the greyhound's racing weight and trying to keep their weights as steady as you can, that's really important as a risk factor, and we see that through our data sets. And then there's a few weaker correlations. Interestingly, whether a greyhound is bred in New Zealand or imported from Australia, that has an impact on injury rates. The frequency that you're racing your greyhounds, how often they're racing and for how long, that has an impact, although a weaker one. The speed that the greyhound's going is a factor. And then their box draws, as we'll see, is also a factor. So this is just a bit of a heat map. And so what that shows you is the bigger circles obviously have a higher correlation with serious injury, and the smaller ones a slightly lesser correlation. And that big red one, returning to racing after 21 days, that's a really big risk factor for injury. The age of the dog, the age of starting racing, really big risk factors. And then the slightly smaller ones are your racing intensity, the level of training that the dog has, and that's to different tracks, and then weight differences. So you can see here that 2 to 3% of dogs have a career-ending injury within its first 10 starts. And that's telling us that fitness to race and the way you train and prep your dogs is really important, right? We want to get them through those first 10 starts unscathed. And then on the other end of the scale, dogs with more than 60 starts in their career also have a higher risk of injury. Interestingly, when we looked at the massive trainers with many dogs in training versus the smaller trainers have a higher injury rate overall, okay? And that might be to do that perhaps smaller trainers have other jobs, or they have other things that they're doing, and so they perhaps are resting their dogs more frequently, or they're not able to keep up the sort of same routine with racing that the bigger trainers are doing. So there's something in the way that the training methods are affecting injury rates as well.
There's no doubt with that one as well. Is if you've got 10 dogs and you have one injury, it's 10% of your crop, and if you've got 100 and you've had 2, you're at 2%. So it all works itself out, but that's a similar fact to Australia as well.
Yeah. And then high racing intensity can really lead to career-ending injuries, really especially in the early stages of that dog's career. So it's about how you space your races and how often you race them in a month. That's really important. So these can be a little bit confusing, but have a look at the guys that are sort of sticking out the top there. So if you have a look at the blue line there, this is looking at sprint racing, and sprint racing is the most common racing type in New Zealand at the moment. And this is having a look at the ages of the dogs racing, and you'll see there that the blue line is your 5 to 6 year old dogs, and they're way ahead in the injury rates, much higher than everyone else. Then the yellow line is your 4 to 5 year old dogs. They're also fairly high, but there's a little spike in the grey line at 3 to 4 years of age. And so I say any dog racing over 14 months of age, you really want to be careful about serious injury rates and take any sort of niggle more seriously.
Is there any, is there any reasoning around that major peak in 18-19?
Yeah, it's a really interesting one there. We know we get seasonal spikes, and we also know that, I guess depending on the population dynamics where it's at there, where your balance of racing dogs are in terms of age could also affect a spike. Sure.
Yeah, absolutely.
I was on get the Grand Brooklyn program. The spike with the 5 6, we don't see too many 5 and 6 year old dogs. They're mostly 5 to 4.
Yeah.
So that population might be quite small.
That's right, and that's what I'm saying, where your population dynamic is,
So
and the balance can really affect it. Yeah.
Your population settlement might be much larger than that one. Therefore, it may not necessarily be consistent about.
And what we're seeing in these dogs when we're analysing the data is really your over 4 year old dogs are having a lot of gracilis muscle injuries, right? They're mostly serious muscle injuries. They're not usually serious fractures, but a lot of them are serious muscle injuries.
That spike in the 18-19 season, though, would that be the on effects of 2 to 3 years prior when the rules changed around breeding? So our breeding numbers actually dropped in the 2 years leading into that spike, so people are holding on to the older dogs a lot longer because there's nothing else coming through, there's no younger stock.
Yeah, 100%.
So
yeah.
have you guys been able to look at that data as well to correlate to the higher injury rates for those older dogs, just for the fact that there's not enough numbers coming through and people having to hold on to the older dogs?
Yeah, absolutely. And that's really important. It's understanding how the whole population dynamic and how you sort of program the race program and how you manage the population of racing greyhounds is going to have an impact, right? So if you know that there's an aging population, we're breeding less dogs or we're importing less dogs, it all has an impact. Yeah, so it's really important to have that.
I know it affected our industry probably 8 years ago where they decided that there were no more New Zealand Racing Series races like that. But we breed today in 2 years' time.
That's
and
right.
onwards.
Yeah, yeah.
So any decisions made now for our dogs, we need to be looking 4 years ahead, not trying to change it overnight because it can't happen.
No, that's
So
right.
the on effects take a lot longer, and I'd say that's why those injury spikes happened in that season, because I know we did change some rules around the breed a couple of years prior to that.
Yeah. Yeah, it's absolutely a good point. And we know that currently our breeding numbers are down, right? There's been a bit of a loss of confidence in the industry, and we've had a little bit of a dip now this year in breeding numbers. So that's going to affect, we know that now, it's going to affect our population for 2 years' time. And those are all kinds of things we can look at. Is another question?
I think with the questions, we've got to use the microphone so that it all goes back in and your dulcet tones get put onto the VHS.
Right. Have you got times of years serious injuries are happening around the country? Like
We do.
January, February,
Yeah.
November, whatever? Have you got that today for us to see?
I don't, and that's something we certainly look at, but we know that that's consistent across all jurisdictions, so you definitely see a summer spike. So you're seeing a spike in the fourth quarter and the first quarter of every year, and then it's less over the winter periods, definitely, yeah. And we think, I mean, Scott can talk more to that, but we think that has a lot to do with the amount of moisture in the tracks. And that's not just the race tracks, that's got to do with the home tracks as well, right? It's the tracks where the greyhounds are raced and prepped every day, or
Yeah.
trialled and slipped. Yeah.
Ironically, the tracks in those summer periods are a lot wetter. They're presented that way because they need to have more moisture put in them to get to a certain level. So we talk about it being multifactorial, and it is, you know. The racetrack itself is presented typically in about the same mould as it is in the middle of winter. However, there's other factors, home straights, home runs, you know, what dogs are doing in their yards, all of these things. Everything needs to go into the pot to be able to understand why there is a spike. But there is a definitive spike in, they call it hock season over in Australia, and that's that January to sort of March period, and it's no different anywhere.
So I'll move on, and this is a really interesting one for us. And there's a number of probably reasons why this might be happening, but this is, again, sprints. I've focused mainly on sprints today. And this is having a look at greyhounds that have rested. So greyhounds in the blue line that have raced within the last 7 days and their injury rate, greyhounds that have raced in the orange line in the last 2 to 3 weeks and their injury rate, and then greyhounds that have been off for 21 days or more and their injury rate. And it's pretty stark. You can see how high the injury rate is in those dogs that have rested for at least 21 days. And I think there's a number of factors happening here. One is obviously a greyhound that's rested for 21 days or more has likely got an injury. Okay, it's got either a muscle injury or a ligament or joint injury. It might even have a little stress fracture there. And what we know about resting for 21 days is that the bones go through a remodeling phase. And we know they've done a lot of work in thoroughbreds on this. And 3 weeks is just about when the bone is at its weakest point in that remodeling phase. And after 6 weeks, it's back to full strength again. So it's almost better to rest a dog for longer and then give it a really good return fitness prep than it is to rest it for shorter and assume it's still fit to race. So we know that dogs will probably keep their fitness for around 10 days, but then they start to drop off and they need to be prepped properly to bring them back to racing. This was another interesting one that we looked at, and I thought it might appeal to the audience here. So this is looking at greyhounds that were bred in New Zealand versus greyhounds that were imported from Australia and their injury rates. And you can see that the white line is the New Zealand injury rate, the yellow line is the Australian dog's injury rate, and the average is in the red. So you're seeing here that it appears that dogs that were imported from Australia would have a much higher injury rate racing in New Zealand than dogs that are actually bred here. And I think there's a number of reasons for that. One of them is that Australia is probably not sending their very best dogs here. Okay, so potentially the dog might have an underlying issue or has previously had an issue that they don't want to continue to race it in Australia. Or perhaps it doesn't chase very strongly. That's a common reason why they send them to New Zealand. But if they're not chasing strongly, there might be a reason for that too. And then if we have a look at this chart, if you have a look at the average age of greyhounds racing that are bred in New Zealand versus imported, the Australian dogs are a lot older. Okay, they've got a lot more races under their belts already when they come here, generally. So age could most certainly be a factor in that data. And I guess this just illustrates that the conclusions we draw from the data are really important. And as you pointed out, if you have a look, maybe what happened a few seasons back, or what other factors might be, contributing to the conclusion that you're drawing. This one is another really important one that we had a look at. And this is a little bit confusing, but basically if you have a look at the red dotted line across the middle of those charts, this is having a look at the weights of greyhounds and their injury rates, right? So the little red dotted line is an average injury rate across the population. And so each of the bars that are above that red dotted line are higher injury rates, right? And there's a slight difference here between bitches and dogs, which is also interesting. So if you have a look at the chart on the left, that's bitches. And you can see that a decrease in weight of between 1 and 1.5 kilograms in a bitch, and we'd say that's pretty large for a bitch, right? That's going to have a large increase in their serious injury rate there, okay? In the dogs, it's both an increase and a decrease, okay? It's going to have an effect on their serious injury rate. And we've got some fascinating data here with weights. It's really, really interesting to see the injury rates with an increase and a decrease in weight. And it's a really important thing I think that trainers can have an influence on. Your weight's probably quite a sensitive indicator of fitness or of stress in a greyhound. And keeping the weights as steady as you can is going to make sure that your greyhound's healthy and fit to race. And I think once you're seeing these massive weight discrepancies, I really think you need to question whether your greyhound should be racing at all. Certainly in Australia, the rules are with a 1 kilogram weight difference, the dog would be scratched. And that's probably the best thing we can do for them, looking at the injury rates.
Have you compiled the data with the injury rates? The injury rates with the increase or decrease after 21 days, because obviously a lot of dogs do come back from a spell or from an injury and do have that weight difference. Have you got the data of those increases of different time periods as well? Because that'd play a massive part.
Absolutely.
So obviously like a dog that's had, say, 21 days off and is up a kilo, probably the chance of an injury is less than a dog that's up a kilo or down a kilo within the 7 days. So that'll be important data as well. Is that available?
It is, and we've looked at it. You'd think that, right? And intuitively, I think that was built into the rules in Australia, where they say if you're 1 kilo up or down, but you've been off for 28 days or more, then we won't scratch the dog. Because we assume that, that's because you're returning after 28 days. And actually, no, that doesn't stack up. I think the fact that it's been more than 28 days and the dog's got a kilo of weight difference is probably worse of a risk factor, just looking at our injury rates.
Just at the data?
Yeah, at the data.
Yeah.
So it's a really interesting thing. I think that the combination of that's probably more of a risk factor rather than less of a risk factor. That racing every 7 days is a bit more protective.
Yeah.
But I would say that a dog that loses a kilo in 7 days, I'd be looking really closely at that dog for why.
Yeah.
I mean, we see it even in the data, dogs 2 days later that have lost a kilo. And that you'd be thinking, really, the dog didn't recover very well from that run at all. Certainly in horses, they are monitoring the racehorses all the time for that. And they'd consider spelling that horse if it dropped weight like that after a run. And yeah, the other thing on weight is we've had a look at the distribution of those weights across various time points of rests. And it's interesting, sort of 50% of the weight change population is a decrease and 50% is an increase. So there doesn't seem to be a clear trend in the data set between whether the dogs are picking up weight as a weight discrepancy or losing weight as a weight discrepancy. They're sort of even, and they're equal risk factors, pretty much. Slightly more on the decrease for bitches because they're lighter. So, yeah. So age of first start, and that was something I touched on earlier. We know in thoroughbreds that starting them at 2 is protective. For injuries, you want to start them early and get that really, their bones and ligaments while they're still growing, adapting to their exercise schedule, okay? And this shows you a little bit about how important this is. And having a look at the 3-year-old starting greyhounds, and there wouldn't be many of those again, so I take your point about the skew in terms of injury rates in that population, but it is much higher in those dogs. And we see that consistently when we review the data, that dogs that are starting later Why are they starting later? For a start, I think my worst category of racehorse was always the unraced 4-year-old. You don't want to be seeing those because you know they've got a problem. That's why they started later, okay? Usually that's the reason. They've had an injury in training and they have to start later, and that injury is going to have an impact on their career. So if you have a look there, the lowest category were those greyhounds that started in the 16 to 20 month category. You'll see that there's a couple under 16 months. And I think that rule came into effect a bit later in the data where you had to be 16 months to start. So there are still a couple that eked in at under or maybe on the 16 months. But generally, starting them between 16 and 20 months old is the best that you can do. And then approximately 70% of greyhounds are introduced under 2 years of age. That's the majority of your population anyway. And about 10%, which I thought was quite high actually, are introduced to racing over 2.5 years of age. And there's some trainers, we can see it in the data, who has what pattern. And some trainers do prefer to start them later.
Michelle, with your experience in horse racing, one of the surprise things that I believe is that you had no surprises when you saw the bone injuries with dogs between 21 days, dogs starting later, because you've already experienced exactly the same thing in 21 days for horses. Is that correct?
Yeah, that's right. Yeah, there's a lot of similarities there. I think bone is bone is bone. When I've discussed that with some of the experts that are doing the work in bone in thoroughbreds, Chris Whitten at University of Melbourne, Chris Riggs in Hong Kong, they say bone is bone is bone. They haven't studied greyhound bone, but they reckon bone behaves the same way pretty much in any human or animal athlete. And bone modelling that they've done with the microfractures, stress fractures, and the way it models, it's very similar data all across the board. Yeah.
And it's, various people bring up and say, oh, look at that buttering, the dog just turned 16 months old, it's out on the track, and it's racing and going, as if it was a bad thing, but the data is showing the exact opposite. That's actually beneficial. Yeah,
you need to start them younger, but the way you start them is important. Like you wouldn't start a younger dog and then race it 6 times a week. That's going to be not detrimental for it, you know. So the way you start them and the progression into a higher racing frequency is really, really important.
Has there been any data done for the like the breeding of the dogs that makes any difference, like the rearing? So supplements that are fed, or the big paddocks, small paddocks, reared with a full litter split. Is there any data to show the injuries of those younger dogs at 16 to 20 months old based on their rearing?
No, there isn't, and I think that's a gap. I think that's something we really need to look at.
Obviously, they play a big part. I mean, if a horse is locked up in a stall its whole life, it ain't going to make a racehorse at 3, 4, 5 years old. But if it's out in a big paddock, or it's fed this supplement or that supplement, I mean, that is going to play a massive part.
We know with horses that limb development and strong ligaments and everything they really need to be out in an open paddock and running around from when they're born. So I'd say with greyhounds, you know, they need to be running around with their littermates and kept. And I think the majority of rearers do that. I think nutrition, you touched on nutrition and the supplements and what you're feeding the young dogs. I think that's got to play a vital part. And that's something we can certainly start to look at, is what are the different types of nutrition and rearing practices that are, you know, benefiting these dogs and having longer racing careers. I think one of the other things that we need to start looking at as well is there a familial or a family breeding line disposition to certain injuries? And you hear it. I mean, I've heard it from greyhound trainers many times. It'll say that whole litter had heart fractures, or, you know, they were no good, they had a weakness somewhere. And I think there's probably some truth in that, you know, whether that's the rearing practice or whether that's actually that breeding line. Maybe a bit of both. You know, if you rear one breeding line a certain way, you're maybe going to end up with injuries. So I think
we had a point in Victoria where we review all the major and deaths. Every single one of them is reviewed, and one trainer popped up. He'd had 3 deaths in the space of about a month, and it turned out all the same litter. And the others had all had injuries in their yards or training sessions as well. So that particular litter was, you know, unfortunately didn't have the right composition for racing, and they were, you know, they were breaking down and being euthanised on the track. So yeah, it does happen. Yeah.
So I wanted to talk to you a bit about the work of the Serious Injury Review Committee. So this is something that we've stood up a couple of months ago. The committee's now met twice, and we started looking at data from January onwards. We look at all of these kind of risk factors that I'm talking about today in all of the racing injuries that happen. And you can see some of the red and orange in that data set. This was really to show you, this was all of the injuries from the 1st of May to the end of July this season. And the red and orange and yellow in there is showing where there were risk factors that we know are present in those dogs that were injured at the track. So some of the things I'm talking about, the weight discrepancies, all of the ones on the far right column had recent spells or multiple spells leading up to that injury event, the 21-day breaks, age at first start, 14 months, which is pretty old, and some with the same trainer, some on the same day. So there's a number of risk factors there that we look at in that data. And what we're trying to do is get to the point where we can become more predictive with it. So we can build a bit of a predictive model into our population that flags these risk factors so that we can ring you up when you nominate and go, well, you might want to think again about this dog because we can see that, it's flagging red for a number of risk factors for injury, and how have you prepared that dog to race? Are you sure it's fit? And we'd like to get there so we can prevent these injuries before they happen. I think we've had a lot of discussion, but I'm happy if anyone's got any questions to take any further questions.
No, working well. Yeah.
So the next category, which really contributes to injuries, as we know, is racing incidents, right? Those are those collisions and falls that we see on the track, the interference, the bumps. And I wanted to show you just a little bit of data. It's interesting here that if we compare sprint racing on the left to middle distance racing on the right, the middle distance, you can see all of the little lines are fairly close together and they're quite uniform. So there's not a lot of difference between an inside and an outside draw for a middle distance race in terms of the frequency of injuries. But when we look at sprints, they diverge. So the lines are apart from each other. And you can see there that the inside boxes 1 and 2, very high injury rate compared to the other boxes, okay? And the reason for this is, Scott's going to talk to a lot, is to do with the track design. So we know that the tracks that we have were never built with short course sprint racing in mind. They weren't designed thinking, oh, we'll run a 300-meter race around this track. They were designed back in the day when our races were predominantly 720s or 500-meter races, and the sprint races were put in afterwards. Those starts were put in afterwards with no concern or thought really about the design of the track and where the dogs were going to corner to achieve that straight racing, that sprint racing. So you can see what it's done to our injury rates. The squeeze boxes, the 1 and 2s, they're having to run rapidly to the rail, and they're having collisions, and that's got to do with the distance from the boxes to the first turn very often. So that's just a bit of background, and you can actually see it in the data that we've got a bit of a design issue with our sprint racing. So what have we done about that? Well, we've got preferential box draw racing in New Zealand. I think, Scott, you were saying...
I have to commend New Zealand for this activity because this has been tried at theoretical level. Over in Australia, reports were done. We put safe racing strategies up 5 years ago. About running preferential box draw, and it's still sitting in a paper somewhere and it's on their list of things to do. The fact that New Zealand has ripped the Band-Aid off and had a crack at it is sensational, and they should be commended for it, and even better that the results are showing what we thought they would from a positive outcome. So well done to those that have made the decision to give them a go, and it's great to see that they're supported by this sort of data.
Yes, as we know, we started this initiative off in the C1 sprinters, and you can see that the data from the slide before in sprint racing, why it was so vital to introduce that initiative into sprint racing. And the way we measure injuries is per 1,000 starts, and so it was really important that we waited until we had enough starters. So we've got, if you have a look on the red series there, Addington, and Addington is separate to all of the other tracks because Addington's had more PBD starts, right? So Addington's had just over 1,000 starts now, and we can look at the data and know that it's a bit meaningful because we've already counted 1,000 starts. So if you have a look at the yellow bar, the total injury rates, that's interesting. So, right, if we said to aunties or to people that monitor our racing, we're just going to look at total injuries, it wouldn't give you a really accurate picture of safety in the preferential box draws because we can see there that the total injury rate is a little bit higher for preferential box draws. But if you have a look at the breakdown of injuries, that's really, really important. So the 1 to 10 day injuries, the little minor niggles, the cuts, the bruises, they're a little bit higher in the preferential box draws. And part of the work of the Serious Injury Review Committee is actually going to look and try to understand why that is. What are we picking up in preferential box draws that in a 1 to 10 day that we're not picking up in other races? But we're okay with that. I'm happy to have 10 per 1,000 starts of those little minor injuries and have a look at the 43 to 90 day fracture injuries and serious muscle injuries and see none and no dogs euthanized. And the fall rate of much lower, 4.6 versus 6.3. So
That's the critical one for
Yeah.
mine, because the injuries are typically, the serious ones are as a result of an incident. And to have a fall rate going down, the next part to go with this would be your collision rate, so your checks, how many checks have been, whether they've gone up or down in the races, because ultimately they are the trigger for an injury to occur. So not always an injury occurs as a result of a fall, but a fall is a fall. So understanding that rate's gone down significantly is critical to the success.
yeah, absolutely. And you can see it. So all of the other tracks have had sort of half, 500 starters, not quite 1,000 starters yet. So I can expect those numbers to level out a little more as we get more data. But again, you can see that no euthanasias. And we've had a couple of serious injuries, and those will get diluted out as we have more starters. But again, the serious injuries more than 21 days is half. The fall rate's really low in all the other tracks. So I think we can, I'm not even sure that this data accurately paints a picture of just how much safer preferential box draws really are. And I think if we went down into the incident rate, or as you said, the collision rates and the reports in stewards' reports, we'd see that it's actually a lot cleaner. We know that 68% of injuries occur on the turn. One of the ways we can eliminate that collision and basically take away the risk of the turn is by introducing preferential box draws. And the other way is just by racing it down the straight and not having a turn at all.
Oh.
Sure.
Yeah.
Is the random other graded dogs with those C1? Because the people next to
It's all the other C1s. Yeah. Yeah, that's right. Yeah.
And with your 1,000 starters, is that the first 1,000, the last 1,000, the middle 1,000, the most recent 1,000? What is that 1,000? So there's 3,000 random starters in the top section there at Addington. So what is that 1,000?
So that's just a time frame. So it's from the introduction of PBD up until the date that this data was run.
Yeah, but
That's how many.
So your injuries per 1,000 starters, what are the 1,000 starters? Is it the last 1,000 dogs that have gone around Addington? Or is it the middle 1,000, or is it average? Because you might
It's
have
averaged, yeah.
average.
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah.
And the other thing that just to bring up is, the data showing that there's actually more minor injuries in the PBDs. Is that because the RIB has now decided, I've noticed over the last sort of 12 months, they're sending dogs to
Yes,
the vets
absolutely.
way more often than they normally would, and they're getting stand-downs for little nicks that
Correct.
we just fix at home
Yeah.
and they're fine the next week, But that's more data going on to our injury statistics.
And that's consistent across in Australia as well, where a change in vet or a change in steward can see a spike in particularly that lower end.
Yesterday at Palmerston North, there were 2 dogs that were stood down for 3 days for a minor abrasion.
Yeah.
Well, that's now data on our 1 to 10 days for a 3-day stand down.
That's right, yeah.
So,
And we know that the number of examinations has, that ratio we looked at in New South Wales, we counted it every single quarter for the 3 years that I was there, 3.5 years. And you're more likely to find an injury when you examine a dog than when you don't examine a dog. That's kind of intuitive. But the ratio is absolutely constant. So we would examine always like 52% of dogs that were racing and not examine 48%. And I think starting to measure the number of dogs we check that have no injury is quite important as well. to have a look at that ratio. But there's no doubt the more dogs you examine, the more the vet's going to find a little nick or a abrasion, as you say, or they're usually insignificant. So
really what you're saying, we need to look at the falls as the most significant.
yes, and the serious injuries.
Yeah, that number in the falls, is that the is that the number per 1,000 starts? Did
Yes.
you say? Okay. Yeah. And have you done any stats on that? Is it relative risk or odds ratio?
No. So there's no stats put into this data yet. I think the data set's still really small. Yeah. So what we're doing at the moment with UTS is we're having them look at, they've got access to the whole Australasian database of all of the injuries throughout Australia. So each of the risk factors we identify, we've said to them, look, can you go and look in the bigger data set to see whether it's statistically significant in that big data set as well. And that sort of gives us a better understanding of where to target the mitigations. If you're going to make up a new rule or a new policy or a new regulation, then you need to base that on stats, as you're saying. Yeah.
All right. So I know Professor Eager presented at this forum a couple of years ago and would have spoken about centrifugal force and jerk and snap, but we're talking about racing incidents here, so track design becomes a major contributing factor to that. And what we're talking here is just at a really high level, the centrifugal force on the greyhound, so that's the pressure that they're applied when they're going around the turns, and what that's measured is up here in newtons on the left, sorry, and what we know is that by dogs going around a turn, they are pulling a certain amount of Gs and getting force onto their lower limbs. If we make them go around 2 turns, well, all of a sudden we're doing it twice as much. So down the bottom there is the amount of centrifugal force that a greyhound experiences running in a straight line. So you take out all of the other factors around other greyhounds and box draws and where they want to get to in the run and whether they've been at the track and all of the experience and other pieces around it. And you talk purely on the science, and the science says if we push them around a bend twice, if we push them around a bend that's smaller, the forces are going to be higher. We put them around a bend that's bigger, a big one-turn track, those forces come down. So these forces cause racing incidents as well. So that's at the really high level. When you're looking at track design, you're looking at how they transition into a turn and how they transition out of a turn, and we try and get the science right about the design. But ultimately, the bottom one around force, if they run in a straight line, they don't experience any of that. So this is, again, some national data. I've cleaned it up and taken out who it is because it's not fair to present individual tracks, but you've basically got 4 straight tracks there compared with 1 2-turn in Australia and 1 turn in Australia. And they're the major injuries and catastrophic. So to Michelle's point earlier and to the point around the smaller injuries, the 1 to 10 days, there's a lot involved in those. There can be a lot of a change of vet or steward that can affect those numbers. These ones, they're numbers that can't be adjusted. They are a major injury or they're a euthanasia on track. And what we see there is a consistency that the straight tracks have a lower injury rate per 1,000 starters than the 2-turn, and in the catastrophics than the 1-turn. So, and it's not just the fact that the 2-turn has a higher major injury rate, it's the percentage. It's nearly double the worst straight track.
I mean, you know who these are, Scott. I mean, you've de-identified these. Yep. Would you say the 2-turn track that's reflected here is one of the worst performing ones? Or
absolutely
one of the better
not. No, it's mid-pack from a 2-turn perspective. So this is not grabbing the worst of the worst and comparing it. This is putting one in the middle of the 2-turn and one in the middle of the 1-turn and comparing it with those straights. So one thing about building a straight track is that it's not the elixir. It will not fix every injury. You can still have a 12-month period where a 1-turn track can be safer than a straight track, and it's happened. I've seen it consistently over the years because it comes down to that multifactorial. You build a straight track, but you don't manage it well, you don't prepare the surface well, you don't look after it, and you don't nurture it. it can perform badly, and that's the facts of it. Likewise, you get a one-turn track that gets extremely well looked after. You know, they're regularly harrowing, they're regularly turning the surface, they've got their moisture and penetrometer readings all well under control. It can outperform a straight track. However, if it's consistent and they're both treated, maintained and prepared consistently, a straight track will always beat a one-turn and will always beat a two-turn track. So that just gives you a bit of an understanding of where they sit in the scheme.
With the straight tracks in Australia, though, could that be relative to the quality of animal that's actually going around those tracks? Because,
100%.
I mean, watching the races,
Yep.
the dogs that are performing on those straight tracks, they're not going to Melbourne for the $1 million chase. You know, so that's all relative as well, surely.
Yeah, it is.
Yeah, I'm glad you raised that because I think we saw that a lot at Richmond when it first opened the straight track there. Every trainer that had a greyhound that had done a gracilis, that they'd retired and thought, oh, it's done, can't go around the turn anymore, they brought them all back. And we thought, oh, geez, these dogs probably shouldn't be racing. But they are, and they race really successfully on the straight track, actually. And our injury rate on the straight track is still lower, despite the fact that the population of dogs are skewed towards those that are a little bit broken or a little bit older or a little bit injured, and probably couldn't make it around the two-turn. So I think that's a really interesting point. Even though we have that skewed population of dogs, we're still seeing a lower injury rate.
Anything else, Phil?
But I think Laura's point is that, yeah, top 10 to 15% of dogs are never going to run on straight tracks. So you haven't got those elite fast dogs running on there, so that must, that doesn't quite give you a true reading.
Yeah, it's a good point. I mean, there's horses for courses, right? And like you say, it's about how we program the races. The majority of the $1 million chases, the Group 1 races, they're still over the 520.
Yeah.
So those middle distance dogs are still in your Group 1 dogs, and they're pitching to a totally different audience somewhat. But we know in New Zealand, what did you say, Michael, the current stat is for sprint races?
Yeah, well, the last season we just passed 70% of our races were 375 metres or less. It's
So
massively higher than
75% of your dogs are racing on the short course. There's a niche there for straight tracks for sure.
Go back to the stress that's put on the chart you had
Yeah.
of G-forces and that, faster the dog, the higher the stress. So
Yep.
you've still got your elite, even your elite sprinters is a very small number. You know, when you end up with a Group 1 or a Group 2 sprint race, you're still pretty much looking at 16 dogs realistically through New Zealand. And on your elite 520 dogs, you've also got a smaller number, but those dogs, the stress on those dogs is way higher than most of the average dogs in Australia that are getting thrown down a straight track. So that must balance, that chart doesn't give you that extra stress. And I think that's what Laura was trying to do.
Yeah, so the data, other data sets over a 12-month period, when you're talking about metropolitan racing versus level 2 or level 3, the injury rate tends to even itself out. Even though there's less metropolitan racing, everyone says, oh, well, there must be less injuries in that because the dogs are better prepared. They're only racing once a week, they're racing over 500, and all the injuries must be in the bottom pool. It's actually not right. It gets back to that almost even keel. So there's so many factors that go into it, but we'll just try and work our way through the biggest ones down.
I mean, we know from the thoroughbreds, if you take them as an example again, the highest performing thoroughbreds, your Group 1s, are actually at highest risk of injury, always. They're performing at that physiological peak. They can't go, they're almost at that breaking point in terms of their physiology because they are going so fast, and we know speed is a factor in injuries, and they're giving everything. They've got no reserve. They're trying their hardest. So those, I think it's similar in human athletes as well. The ones performing at the top 2%, they're the ones at risk of injury, and they have to be properly managed. I think this is where it's really, really important because the preparation, the fitness, the training, everything that goes into prepping those dogs is really, really important to keep them safe and able to maintain that performance. And equally, the surfaces then that they come to run on those top dogs, we want them to be as safe as they can be for them to be able to perform at that peak.
We said before there were dogs that probably shouldn't be coming back to race. I think they're not encouraging people to maybe we push the dogs that should have been like aren't good enough. aren't good enough or, injury prone to race them again?
Yeah, and I think it's fair. It's about how you prepare them and how fit they are. And we've seen that in Australia. We've seen dogs that perhaps were at the end of their career because they had no more options on two turns, but they actually are able to come back and race once a week on the straight. They're managing that physically and without being injured. And it's provided, Australia's gone the route of doing masters racing, so they've developed a class of racing just for those older dogs and spaced the racing frequency in the program out so that those dogs are able to continue their career for a little bit longer. That reduces the burden again on rehoming because those dogs are able to stay in the racing population for longer.
Another one?
Yeah, I was interested in there was one of those straight tracks that had an injury rate almost twice the others.
Yep.
Was there something about the surface of that track or the maintenance of it without telling us where it is?
Look, again, it depends on the size of the data. If you have one or two major injuries and less runners, obviously it goes up. There's no doubt that through this, the straight tracks actually swap and change their position. So the one that's got 5.7 for majors is not the one that's got 0.4 for cats. It's actually the one at the other end. It had zero euthanasias. So, look, there are factors around track preparation that influence these, and one of those is a grass track, and the other three are sand. So, but no, not a definitive there. Yep. All right, track design, maintenance, all put into the one category, but...
I think Dean's got a question.
Oh, sorry, Dean. Yep.
Good morning. We spoke before the meeting in regard to injuries through races and that, and it's a very important topic come up about the possibility of the effect a lure driver would have on injuries. We're speaking everything about what we should do to dogs, but we're not doing anything, as I see it, about what we should be doing for our lure drivers.
Yep.
And at times when you watch a race, it's hard to visualise what the lure's doing, but it appears at times it'll go fast, it'll slow down, it'll go fast, it'll slow down. And we need to address that problem with our staff as well, insofar as that is that lure driver having a problem with his eyes? Has he got a health problem? There's no compliance that we really need to be able to say, right, on a yearly basis, we need you to do a medical for whatever reason. It can't be a club thing, it's got to be a national policy. But it has such a huge effect on, maybe it's not always the dog, it could be some other factor such as a lure driver that is having a bad day or got bad eyesight.
Yeah, couldn't agree more. Throughout Professor Rieger's work and the work we did in Victoria and in New South Wales, lure driving is a critical factor. It's like all of this. If we get things consistent, that's the sweet spot. We want a consistent track. If it's consistently fast, that's okay. If it's consistently slow, that's okay as well. We don't want a patchy track. We don't want a lure driver that is jerking in their motion or leading the dogs too far or under their nose. We want that sweet spot, and that's why the national rule is 5 to 7 metres. But having experienced it on tracks in Victoria, a change in lure driver can have a massive impact on our injury rate as well. And I've got no doubt that, over here, in Victoria, they actually employ the lure drivers now, taking them back from the club. So that's the highest step. In New South Wales, they register them. They put them through those processes every year. So you've got to be able to give your eye test to the regulator. And once you get to a certain age, you've got to go through a fit and proper from your doctor as well. So it's critical, absolutely critical. And the good lure drivers around Australia and around the world will tell you that a good drive is a good drive and a bad drive is a bad drive. Unfortunately, the bad drives sometimes result in injuries. So couldn't agree more with you. And for something that's a pretty easy, quick fix to be able to register these lure drivers, take it out of the club's hands. The club can still have them as an employee. Simply, GRNZ or the Integrity Board, register them every 12 months, test them. It's just another step to professionalising the sport, and there's no doubt. We've had incidents of tracks where dogs are trying to jump the lure because something's happened, they've gone back and the lure's over there and they've tried to jump the fence. It's not dissimilar to a bad drive, and again, having that consistency, it only takes a little tweak for that dog in front or second to just pull up a little bit, and all of a sudden there's carnage behind, and that can be driven by the lure driver. So I agree, absolutely support your notion.
Struggle with, each club is their own employer, so we contain our staff, but we've got no background, nothing to say this is what you should be doing and shouldn't be doing.
Yep.
And it would be great if GRNZ could take that on board, especially in regard to lure drivers, to say, yes, we will form a policy around that and this is what's got to be done, because we find it hard to go and tell our lure driver that you've got to do this, I've got to do that, and he'll just, basically, it's not in my contract, I don't have to.
Yeah.
So if we could get a national policy from that at some stage.
And look, it's a path well beaten, so it shouldn't be too hard, but I'm not going to talk for the powers that be, but I'm sure they'll adopt it. But
Thank you.
no worries.
So, is there, I spoke to you months ago about, that you said it's a possibility of technology of getting the ability to have the lure registered to the front dog and maintain the distance electronically.
Yep.
Is anybody actually started doing the attempt of doing that?
So we're sort of off path a little bit, but the ISOLINK system that we spoke to the board about yesterday, and for those who don't know it, it's a tracking system. You'll probably have seen it on the television if you've watched Richmond or Traralgon. Down the bottom at its really basic point is that it's got the dog's position, the time, the speed for which they're running at. That is a chip on the back of every dog. That is a system that is localised, that produces an immense amount of data. It's live and it goes at something like, I think the refresh rate is about 100 units per second. So the amount of data that comes out of that is huge. When we're talking the opportunity, you talk welfare, you talk commercial, safety, the whole gamut, it covers it. The ability for it to drive to the lead, at the moment it's got a ability for the camera system, so an automated camera system to follow the lead dog. So unmanned cameras can actually film the whole race based on that same theory. The Traralgon track is built with that integration we spoke about to automate the lure driving to be 10 metres in front. So you've got to have a lure system that can talk to the ISOLINK system, but it is possible, and they'll go down that path at some point. In Victoria, they already have an automated run-up, so they don't drive the lure, they press a button, which means it's a consistent 7-second run-up. It hits the boxes at exactly the same time, so the dog's trying to anticipate it, it's exactly the same at all time. The lure driver takes over as soon as it goes past the boxes. So we're halfway there, but that ability to drive them, the capability is available. Yeah, it is. Hopefully, yeah. So it's a good segue into the data. So data in this sport, we're really, really lucky. There's so much of it. It's been happening for a long, long time, particularly from a wagering perspective and monitoring, dogs' form and all of those bits and pieces, into the amount of injury data that's now available, and that can forever increase, and the more of that we get, the better in terms of understanding what our population's like. The off-track data is something that's probably not as common, and it's something that is an opportunity. What's happening at home, how many kilometres the dog's doing in their runs every day. Are they running up and chasing each other and running, 2Ks, 3 days, 2 or 3 Ks in a day? Is that impacting the amount of output, or are they just sitting in their kennel having a sleep? The track monitoring, which we'll get to, is around track preparation. So water, track surfaces, penetrometers, moisture meters, all these bits and pieces is other ways of using data to start to present tracks in a consistent manner, but also look at forecasting if we think there's injuries on the horizon. And again, through a really strong racing data pack and a racing track monitoring program, you can start to almost be Nostradamus and see that there's injuries coming if the track's not being adhering to the right practices, and I can show you some of this. So again, some guiding principles about racing safety. So we spoke earlier about it being a racing incident or a racing injury and not a track injury, and that's because there's so many factors that go into it. But as a general rule, we're looking to reduce the racing collisions because they're a major cause and effect of the output of catastrophic and major injuries. We want to make sure our decisions are made on good data and evidence-based. So GRNZ's engaged with UTS, which basically brings in all of Australia's opportunity. UTS, University of Technology Sydney, Professor Eager has been involved in greyhound racing for coming up 7 years, I think it is, with his team of PhD students. So every jurisdiction has used UTS and continues to engage with UTS, and the benefits you get from them is that they will support the decisions that are made with evidence. So there is no way that they'll make a decision or support anything unless they can, verify it on the other side. So that gives us a really good springboard to be able to make those decisions based on what the data says. Now, the data is one component to it. We still have the factors, and you've got to bring in the factors of, people's experience, dogs' experience. Oh, that can't happen here because of X. You've got to take all those things into consideration, but ideally, you're making decisions based on data. This will ultimately raise the standards in New Zealand for racetracks, and improving the consistency of the safety standards is what we're trying to do. So getting those minimum standards up to a point where as a trainer you can go to a track, every track you go to, you should expect that that's being prepared up to this minimum standard. Now, developing that minimum standard is the next process we've got to go through over here. But you should expect that that dog is racing on a surface that, as I said before, is consistent. If it's consistently a bit faster, that's okay. Consistently a little bit slower, that's all right. But it's that change from that patch being hot and that patch being soft that really that causes injury. So we want to try and take all of that out through a decent program. And then these days, these programs around increasing stakeholder engagement is critical to it, because it is everyone's involved, everyone needs to, have a piece in this, and it can't just be the regulator or, GRNZ smashing down your throat, this is the way you'll do it. Together, you've got to achieve, and that's around increasing the stakeholder support. So again, Isolinks has produced this data. So this is real live data. This is dogs all having an individual chip on the back of their jumpers and racing in live races. So prior to this, we'd only be able to do it in trial sessions, but now that it's integrated into about 4 or 5 tracks in Australia, we're able to produce this data. So one of the most surprising pieces of the data that came out initially was that when we see a greyhound come from behind, to pass another one with 50 metres to go, you go, gee whiz, how strong's that dog been to the line? It's actually false. That dog's actually decelerated at a slower rate than the one he's gone past. He hasn't sped up to go past him. He's just kept his speed better than the one in front who's come back. So what we see here, I'll get this one. What we see here is that consistently dogs accelerate, and this is consistent, be it a sprint, 500, whatever it might be. Dogs accelerate and hit full speed somewhere between 100 and 150 metres out of the boxes. From there, they're then coming down. It's that rate of deceleration that you see that shows that dog coming from behind and the one in front. So what Michelle referenced before, that 100 odd metre mark to the 150 metre mark, that's when they're going flat out. Now, if they're going flat out 70 metres after the start, they're now trying to go around a bend. They're now trying to compete with, 7 other dogs, and they're about to hit full speed. That's a lot to deal with, particularly with dogs that are coming out of a short sprint that was not designed that way. So that's where we spoke earlier. The 700-metre dogs, the 600-metre dogs, those designs and those tracks were designed for dogs to come out and accelerate, maybe hit their top speed a little bit later, but not accelerate at the same rate. At the moment, if you've got short course racing on a short course, on a track out of a 700 box, for argument's sake, that was designed for a 700, the imbalance is there. So this is where track design is really important, and the ability to design them for today's standards, knowing what we know with this information. So, any questions about that one? No, that's okay. All right. The next one here is showing the track design is the black, and that's the rail, and that's the way that the track is designed from a rail perspective. So whether the dog, if he was to run on that rail, they're the forces that he would or she would encounter. What dogs do, and again through the smoothing out of their running lines, is that they are able to make their own. They're able to make their own running line. So technically, they smooth out the way in which they go around a track. So the track's pushing them sideways and doing these things. They're still under a fair bit of force. Getting a bit of force there. They're still under force and they're still having to accommodate for all of that, but they're smoothing out their own line going around a track. So one of the easier ways, if you stand at the top of a hill and roll a ball down, that ball will find the path of least resistance, and it's exactly what the dogs are doing. They are finding their comfort zone, they are finding the path of least resistance to go around those turns and navigate them. So they're quite smart in the way they race. If you combine the way they race with good track design, all of a sudden you've got a really good marriage. Questions, queries on that one? Yep. So we've spoken about track maintenance, we've spoken about consistency, and having data that comes from the track is critical. So at the moment there is a program in play in New Zealand, but taking that to the next step is what's probably required. That's the ability to have technology telling you how your track is performing before the incidents actually occur. So what other jurisdictions, and this is consistent across Australia, they're using, whether it's a penetrometer, a moisture meter, a Clegg hammer, or what's called a going stick, which Victoria has migrated into a going stick, to measure how their track is being prepared. Again, all the inputs, all the data comes through. They're able to run reports around trends in the data, trends in how the sand is being prepared or the grass is being prepared, your water content, your shear vein, which is the way in which the sand breaks apart. And that's really critical because the greyhounds put their paw in and you want them to get that traction. You want to get a full paw into that sand to give them full traction. Like going for a walk on a slippery day, if it's slipping and sliding, it's causing them to not get the traction, therefore ultimately resulting in incidents or injuries related to that. So this is the way forward. This is the way that we can consistently start to prepare the tracks and give the data back to the participants, back to the trainers, back to the clubs, and that feedback that gets an understanding of where the tracks are. We want the tracks to be in that good range, good 3, good 5, understanding that if they get to too hard or too heavy, then they should be called off. But that data is critical to understanding how they perform and going back to Michelle's earlier spreadsheet around the serious injury review team, if you can put the track data against that as well, you then start to see some trends there. Ideally, you want that track to be in the green range, but if it's getting into the hard range and there's a serious injuries, well, you can legitimately say that the track had an input in it.
Yeah, I think the good news is that GRNZ has invested in the Clegg hammers, the water meters, to measure these things, and also a database to capture all of the data from all of the different tracks. So I think we've just completed rolling out all of the tablets to all of the different track curators at the tracks, and then they'll download the data straight from the machines that have measured them. They can't make the data up.
Yep.
The data is what it is. It is downloaded into the database, and then we have access to that data. The experts have access to that data, and we can look and see where all of the tracks in New Zealand are. The next step for us is obviously to take all of the data readings we have for the different tracks and put it into that middle slide, which will tell us what our rating is for the different tracks. So that's what we're working on next, so that we can then give that feedback to the clubs, to the participants, and when you show up at a track, what it's rated as and where it's going to be and how your dog's likely to perform on that track.
So this is an example of the going stick report out of turf tracks. So these reports are the same for a thoroughbred track as they are for a greyhound track, albeit that the probe on the end has been altered for sand versus grass. And these reports, Flemington today or Caulfield today in Victoria will have a report that comes out on Twitter that tells you how that track is rated, be it good, soft, or whatever it might be, probably heavy today. So you're looking here at the penetrometer, or the penetration it measures. It also measures the shear vane, which is that breaking motion of how the sand stands together, moisture and penetration as well. So these are the kinds of reports that we'd love to get to, a point where you can present this, the track curator does his pre-race analysis, this report's automated, it's uploaded, people get an understanding on how the track is prepared. Got there. So one pretty topical piece of information is around harrowing. People want to get an understanding on what harrowing is, how often it should occur, what the definitions are. So in Victoria, they commissioned a report called the Gleeson Report by a former chief steward of Racing Victoria, Des Gleeson. He undertook an independent review into track harrowing and what that meant. For those who don't know, harrowing is the process of ripping up the sand to certain depths, and that was one of the biggest discussion points, was some classification around what those depths are. People saying, the track's been harrowed, it's off, it's causing injuries. Now, what the definition of that harrow is needed to be outlined. So they went through a process interviewing independents, track people, club people, GOTBA, GRV people, etc. And what they basically found was that the classification was critical, getting an understanding of what had happened at that track, whether it be a shallow harrow, whether it be not even up to 25 mil. People were saying, the track's been harrowed and it had been scratched to 15 mil, which does very little. It's just a nice new surface on top, and underneath still got the same sort of issues. So one of the major pieces to come out of this was the classification, 25 to 40 shallow, 41 to 60 medium, and then a full track renovation is over 60 mil. For those who don't know, most sand profiles are 150 mil, so a full renovation is going down to about halfway or further with those. What was also very critical in the discussions was how injuries correlated with how long it had been between harrows. And 8 weeks was the absolute peak. As soon as it ticked over to 9 weeks, typically the injury rate increased somewhere between 20 and 40%. So they get to a point where they're perfect, and if you haven't got it planned and your system's not about to go, and it ticks over, high probability that your injury rate's going to go up. So having an understanding of how your track operates, how your track needs it, and it all comes down to, again, all sorts of factors, whether they are the amount of rain you've had, the amount of use you've had on the track. If you race once a week versus 3 times a week, well, your harrowing schedule should be 3 times what those that race once a week are. So again, all these factors need to come in. There is no one size fits all, but the one size that fits all is that's the classifications. That's how long the reinstatement should take. So a shallow should take 1 to 4 days, done by the track guys. A medium should take 3 to 5 days to reinstate that, or allow 3 and 5 days between doing it and racing or trialling again. And a major should be shut down for a week to 10 days to allow the track staff to do their job, to treat that surface with the care that they do and get it back to the surface that's ready. You wouldn't want to do a major track renovation and then try and race 3 or 4 days later, because you're asking for you're asking for injuries to occur. So again, just another example of things that are occurring around the world, around Australia in particular, and how they relate here. So using them as the opportunity to learn is critical, and ideally with this one it was about taking out a lot of the skullduggery and all the rumour and innuendo around harrowing of tracks and trying to classify it a little bit and get it cleaner so everyone understands exactly where it sits.
And I think also about providing this data, isn't it? So that you know that when you turn up to trial, when last was the track harrowed? What depth was it harrowed to? How long has it had to consolidate? So that you know when you're going to put your dog on the track, you should know exactly what's happened to it and what the risks are. Yep. I think giving everybody that information just allows everyone to make an informed decision. You know your dog's best, and so you know what you'd like them to be running on.
Absolutely.
And saying that though, like, the trainers shouldn't have to ask.
No.
The track should be prepared. We train our dogs. We come to the trials. If for some reason the track creators decide that it's not up to standard, then pull trials. Don't,
absolutely.
Just do it. Like I'm getting annoyed. Like up our way, where trainers are asking those questions. Well, if there's a problem with the track, fair enough, raise the questions. But we're happy to pull pin if we're not happy with it. So as long as we're following the data, there should be no interaction between trainer and club as such. It should be on the notice board, it was harrowed on this date, and track's good as gold.
Yep.
So, I mean, I understand what you're saying, Michelle. We need to know what we're putting our dogs on, but the clubs also need to be providing that. And if they're not providing that, then there's big issues at the club level, not as a trainer bringing the dogs to the trials or the races.
Yeah, it's about access to the information really, so that you can make that informed decision. And that's what we're saying. Once we've got the data and we know where we're at, we're able to provide that to everyone, so you know.
And trialling is as critical as racing. So that track should be prepared the exact same way as it is for a race meeting.
Yeah.
People who cut corners for trial days versus getting it right for racing are actually making a rod for their own back, because the dogs will trial on a track that's maybe, not prepared well enough. That dog or those set of dogs, and we've seen it in some data reports, that trialled on that day come to a race meeting 4 or 5 days later, and all of a sudden the injury rate's right. And you look at the track and you say, oh, no, the track's pretty good. You go and dig deeper and you look at the trial session data and you say, well, hang on a minute, maybe that's where the issue occurred. So it's about consistency, it's about communicating, it's about getting an understanding from everyone that we want to prepare a track that is standard the whole time. Yeah. And that's it. So we're up to the end. If there's anyone that hasn't made any questions or queries and doesn't feel like it, please grab us afterwards. But outside of that, we'll hand back to you, Jim.